Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning and for your participation and support of the book festival again this year. A few housekeeping announcements before we get started. The book festival has collaborated with local bookseller Max Backs Books on Coventry for book sales at this year's festival. If you would like to purchase a signed copy of this morning's book, please visit the JCC website and you'll be directed to Max Backs for ordering. The link to Max Backs will also be available in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker, and I hope you do, please type them in the chat. We will do our best to get to as many today as we can. Without further ado, on to today's special guest author. In 1990, in a basement archive in Prague, two American historians made a startling discovery: a Nazi roster from 1945 that no Western investigator had ever seen. The long forgotten document helped unravel the details behind the most lethal killing operation in World War II. In the Polish village of Trawniki, the SS set up a school for mass murder and then recruited an army of foot soldiers, 5,000 men strong, to help annihilate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. After the war, some of these men vanished, making their way to the United States and blending into communities across America, their terrible secrets intact. In a story spanning 7 decades, Citizen 865 chronicles the harrowing wartime journeys of 2 Jewish orphans who outran the men of Trawniki and settled in the United States, only to learn that some of their one-time captors had followed. A tenacious team of Nazi hunters pursued these men and, up against the forces of time and political opposition, battled to the present day to remove them from US soil. You can see why we were really excited to bring Debbie Senzaper today to speak to all of you. Debbie is an investigative journalist and author based in Washington, D.C. She's a contributing reporter for the investigative team at the Washington Post. She has won several major awards in American print journalism, including the 2007 Pulitzer Prize and the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Human Rights Reporting. She is the Director of Investigative Journalism at Northwestern University. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Debbie Senzaper.
Good morning, and thank you, Lisa and Deborah and Nancy, for having me here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone. So happy that you're taking time out to hear a little bit more about this book, and I'd love to answer your questions when I'm done. I also love taking time out of writing coronavirus stories for the Post to talk about this book. It means a lot to me. I dedicated it to my 2 college-age sons, and I'm always happy to talk about it. So thank you for having me here. I'll talk to you just, I guess, a little bit about how this book got started. In the final moments of 2016, I was at a New Year's Eve party in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. with my husband, who desperately wanted to leave, I think because he thought I was going to force him to dance to the disco music that was playing at this party. And I fell into a conversation with a lawyer, a prosecutor from the U.S. Department of Justice, who started telling me about this unit inside the Justice Department that had spent the better part of 30 years hunting for Nazi war criminals who had slipped into the United States after the war and were essentially hiding in plain sight in American cities and suburbs, from New York City to Fort Lauderdale to Chicago to Cleveland. And I remember leaving there that night with 2 questions. One was, how was it possible that we were still finding Nazi war criminals and collaborators living in the United States so many decades after the end of World War II? I just couldn't wrap my head around that. And I also wanted to know more about the prosecutors and historians inside this unit who had spent, in some cases, their entire professional lives living inside some of the darkest moments in recent history, interviewing not only Holocaust survivors and witnesses, but also mass murderers who described under questioning the act of mass murder in such clinical and technical terms. And I've read some of those transcripts, and it's beyond chilling. And I really just wanted to know more about the people doing this work and how they were able to separate those dark moments from their everyday lives, how they were able to go home at night to their husbands and their wives and their children, and in some cases their grandchildren, and live an ordinary life when during the day they were immersed in such dark, horrific moments. And so, I had spent at that time about a decade on staff at the Washington Post. I've been an investigative reporter for 25 years at the Miami Herald and the Washington Post and other newspapers. And even though I had lived and worked in Washington for that long, I really didn't know much about this unit and very much wanted to know more. And so in the early weeks of 2017, I called an historian named, whose name is Elizabeth Barry White. And Barry now works in DC at the Holocaust Museum, but she had spent years inside this Nazi hunting unit at the Justice Department. And over our conversation, she described this moment in 1990 where she and a handful of other historians were invited to go to the archives in Prague. And this was a coveted, extraordinary invitation because the communist governments in Eastern Europe had generally refused to allow Western historians to come in to look at Nazi rosters and records that were likely stashed in these cities either by the Germans or by the Soviets in 1945. And so this invitation from Prague was unprecedented. And Barry and her colleagues had no idea what they might find there, but they eagerly accepted the invitation. They traveled to Prague, and under the cover of night, they pulled into their rental apartment, and a Soviet caretaker greeted them. And Barry White was 3 months pregnant at the time and was not feeling well. So you can imagine the conflict she felt when she had to politely refuse pork cutlets and beer for breakfast the next morning. Soviet caretaker absolutely insisted, and Barry politely declined. And one morning on this visit to Prague, a government sedan pulled up. Armed Czech security agents got outside, and they ushered in Barry White and another historian who was with her named Peter Black. And they took them over to the archives, and they were led out to this vast room filled with armed Czech security agents. And through an interpreter, Peter Black, the historian, said, "My name is Peter Black, and this is Barry White, and we're here representing the US Department of Justice." And of course, all the armed Czech security agents in the room started chuckling because they were thinking, the CIA has no imagination. They must be spies. After all, who would present us with a Barry White and a Peter Black? But of course, they were not spies. They really were historians hired by the Justice Department to help prosecutors search for Nazi war criminals living here in the United States. And so they were shown into the drafty basement archives in Prague. And poor Barry was so sick, she had to rush to the bathroom every hour on the hour. The bathroom was in an elevator air shaft with a chain that flushed the toilet, but she powered through it. And a few hours later, she pushed back her chair, grabbed the file that she had been looking at, rushed over to Peter Black and said, "I think I found something." And what she found in 1990 in the archives of Prague was a document that no Western investigator had ever seen before. And it listed the names of 700 men who served in this little farming community in Poland known as Travniki. And they knew from prior reports that in Travniki there was some kind of a Nazi-run training camp where these recruits, these men, 5,000 of them, helped liquidate the ghettos of occupied Poland. They helped guard the perimeters of the death camps. In some cases, they operated the gas chambers. But Peter Black and Barry White didn't really understand, and no one here in the West did, the scope of this operation or its role in the killing of so many Jews in occupied Poland. And so as they were scanning this list, they recognized several of the names because they had suspected that there were some people from this camp living here in the United States. So as they're going down the list, they recognized the names and they realized that there were men in the United States who had lived here for decades, who had served inside this operation, who had been trained in what was, in every sense of the word, a school for mass murder in occupied Poland. And so that Nazi roster that Barry was looking at from 1945 led this office, this Nazi hunting unit, on a 15-year journey into the men of the Travniki training camp. These men were so essential to the SS in occupied Poland that there's no way the SS could have murdered 1.7 million Jews without the help of the Travniki men, 5,000 of them. And they were murdered in an operation called Operation Reinhardt. We know that, of course, far more than 1.7 million Jews were murdered in occupied Poland, but 1.7 were murdered in the span of 20 months, fewer than 2 Polish summers. And they were murdered in large part with the help of these 5,000 Travniki recruits. Many, some of whom were living here in the United States. So let me just share just a little bit of history with you about Travniki. Travniki, as I said, was a little Polish farming village south of Warsaw. And before the war, it was, a couple hundred Jews lived there. But it was a very strategic location for the Third Reich because Travniki was connected to major Jewish hubs by rail lines. And so it was a good place to train an army because you could then dispatch these men to places like Warsaw and Krakow and other places in occupied Poland. The Germans needed these Travniki men because the German boys were busy fighting on the front lines, fighting the Soviets. There were not enough Germans to do the dirtiest jobs in occupied Poland. So the SS came up with a remarkable plan. They started recruiting from the ranks of civilians. They brought in young men who were Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Poles. And they also went to Soviet POW camps and they recruited captured Soviet soldiers. And they brought all these men to this little training camp in Travniki. They gave them uniforms, food, housing, health insurance. They armed them. They trained them. They taught them Nazi ideology. There were reports that Travniki men were, quote, forced to shoot a Jew to prove their loyalty to the Nazi cause. And it was an incredibly successful, horrific operation because they brought together 5,000 largely uneducated men, including men that they were actually fighting against, Soviet soldiers, and they turned them into this lethal, roving killing force. And so after they were trained at Travniki, they were dispatched to the Jewish ghettos of occupied Poland. The first place they were sent in the early months of 1942 was the town of Lublin, Poland. And before the war, Lublin had 40,000 Jews. They were very assimilated in the culture. They served on city town council. They owned factories and businesses. Many successful Jews. It was a hub of religious and cultural Jewish life in Poland. And the 40,000 Jews were forced inside this ghetto. And I remember when I was reporting out this book, which is of course a nonfiction book, a true story, I went to Lublin and I walked the old cobblestone streets of this ghetto, and you can see this picture. It's the ghetto and walls, and just outside the walls every weekend there was a Polish farmers market where farmers brought bread and meat and cheese and vegetables. And I remember thinking, as I was standing there, what it must have been like for the parents inside this ghetto to have hungry children and know that just outside the walls there was this food. But this ghetto was a horrific place, of course, like all Jewish ghettos in occupied Poland. But Jews were able to survive there for some time. There was, enough for them to survive, though many died, of course, from disease. But in March of 1942, the men of Travniki, the new recruits, were sent to Lublin on their very first mission. And they surrounded the perimeter of the ghetto. They lighted the street lamps and they called everyone outside and announced that 1,500 Jews a day would be deported or resettled in the East, which of course we now know is Nazi code for murder. And over that night, they shot the sick and the elderly on the spot. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, they deported the Jews of Lublin to the first extermination center to open in occupied Poland. One of the things that I learned, even though I thought I knew a lot about the Holocaust as a Jewish woman, was that there's a difference between the concentration camps and the extermination camps. In concentration camps, Jews were often allowed to live for a time. There were barracks. They served as forced laborers before they were murdered. Extermination camps, the handful of extermination camps like Treblinka in occupied Poland, had no barracks because they were built only for death. Jews were unloaded off the trains, turned over their valuables, undressed, and sent right to the gas chambers. And that became the fate of the overwhelming majority of Jews from Lublin, thanks to the men of Travniki who worked side by side with the SS to liquidate the ghetto. The Travniki men went to the Jewish orphanage. They shot the children as well as their caregivers. They went to the Jewish hospital. They shot the patients, the doctors, and the nurses. And this was a brutal and bloody operation that lasted for a handful of weeks. From Lublin, they were sent to other Jewish hubs to liquidate ghettos. They also manned the perimeters of the death camps and really operated the death camps. In fact, there were more Travniki men in the death camps than members of the SS. The Travniki men, for all intents and purposes, did the bloodiest work in occupied Poland, saving the SS and young German boys from having to do this nightmarish work. The Travniki men were a very willing and able and loyal roving army of foot soldiers. Peter Black, the historian, called them the foot soldiers of the Third Reich. They were so good at what they did, these Eastern European men, so good that Himmler himself came to the Travniki training camp on several occasions to praise the men and to praise the leader of the camp. Travniki men were dispatched to Warsaw, where they fought side by side with the Germans to suppress the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw ghetto. This is one of the most famous pictures of Travniki men standing over the bodies of the dead in the Warsaw ghetto. And when it became clear at the end of the war that the Soviets were approaching, these 5,000 men scattered across Europe. Some returned to the Soviet Union. We didn't know that for years, but they ditched their Nazi uniforms. They ditched their identification papers. And some of them made their way to the United States on visas that were meant for Holocaust survivors and other war refugees. They were able to come to the United States because they lied about their activities and whereabouts during the war, and because here in the United States, in the years, in fact, in the decades after the war, we truly didn't understand what this Travniki camp was or how it fit into the Operation Reinhard, the killing of 1.7 million Jews in 20 months in occupied Poland. Here's this incredibly chilling picture of Travniki men at the Belzec extermination center. You can see this man in front playing the mandolin. And it really was an incredible strategic military operation. What the SS managed to do was take 5,000 largely uneducated men who all spoke different languages from all over Eastern Europe and turn them into this cohesive, lethal killing force. It was a remarkable, horrific operation. And so I describe in this book, and I hope you'll have a chance to read it, this two young kids who were in Lublin, Lucy, or Lucinia you can see, and this is Lucinia's younger brother. And Lucy was only 16 when she was in the ghetto, and she met a boy named Felix, and their families became friends. And they survived the liquidation of the ghetto because Felix's father was a architect, and he had created a double wall in a hole in a wall, and Felix and Lucy crawled in, and they managed to escape the liquidation of the Lublin ghetto. And they made their way to Warsaw because Lucy had an uncle in the Warsaw ghetto. And so they slipped into the Warsaw ghetto, Lucy and Felix, who were just friends, and Lucy's younger brother, David. And the uncle insisted that Lucy and Felix marry because they were two single young people traveling together. And so under the cover of night, Lucy and Felix married in the Warsaw ghetto. They weren't in love at the time. They were babies. I mean, they were teenagers, and they had lost everyone they ever knew. Lucy's parents were killed in the Lublin ghetto, or they were killed in the Lublin ghetto, and in subsequent, some of them were killed there, some of them were killed in the concentration camps and death camps. But they had lost everyone they ever knew. Felix's family, Lucy's family. And as they were marrying, this woman came out from the crowd, and she pulled the wedding ring off of her own finger, pressed it into Lucy's palm, and said, "Here, you wear it. Maybe it'll bring you better luck." And I guess it did, because they decided to leave the ghetto, to try to leave the ghetto just before the Jewish uprising, where they likely would have been killed. And they got out of the ghetto with the help of the Polish underground and managed to live for much of the rest of the war in Warsaw, hiding their identities. And then they ended the war in a little farming village near Krakow. And one day Felix heard the rumbling of Soviet tank engines, which of course meant liberation. The next morning, a Soviet commander walks into the village, and he says to Felix, "Who are you?" Now, Felix was about 19, 20 years old. He had lost his mother, his father, his sister, his grandparents, his aunts, uncles, cousins, classmates, everyone. And he was hungry, he was tired, he was beaten. And for the first time since the start of the war, Felix looked at this Soviet commander and he said, "I'm a Jew." And the Soviet commander said, "You can't be a Jew. All the Jews are dead. You must be a spy." And Felix said, "No, I'm really a Jew." So the Soviet commander calls over another Soviet soldier who happened to be Jewish, and he says, "You're a Jew." He says he's a Jew. Speak Yiddish to each other. Well, of course, poor Felix grew up in a very assimilated Jewish family. In fact, he didn't really go to Hebrew school or to a Jewish school. He went to a private Polish school. His father, though, brought in a rabbi to sit at their kitchen table to teach Felix's prayers. And when the rabbi would nod off, Felix would skip through the pages of his prayer book, so that when the rabbi woke up, he would say, "Look, Rabbi, I'm a good boy. I finished my studies." And that's how Felix grew up. Now he's staring down a Soviet commander and having to prove that he's a Jew. And so somewhere in the depths of his soul, hungry, tired, orphaned, scared, he remembered one prayer, and it happened to be the Shema, the holiest prayer in the Jewish religion. And so the Soviet soldier hugged Felix and said, "Wow, you really are a Jew." And that's how Felix and Lucy survived the war. Lucy's younger brother, David, did not survive, and his story is in the book. It's worth reading. But Felix and Lucy, newly married, decided to walk back to Lublin, 80 kilometers through the snow, to see if anyone had survived. And of 40,000 Jews in Lublin before the war, fewer than 200 survived. Two of them were Felix and Lucy. So they made their way to Vienna because they did not want to live in Lublin anymore. Lucy described it as she felt like every rock had blood on it. And so they ended up in Vienna, where Felix finished medical school, went to medical school. And then Lucy had a distant cousin in New York City who sent for them. And so they obtained visas, and in the early 1950s came over and settled in New York City and ultimately moved to the Midwest. And it was years later that Felix turned to his son and had picked up the newspaper and read about this Nazi hunting unit inside the Justice Department, and said to his son, how is it possible that these men are still living here? Because what Felix realized later in his life, that some of the same men who had liquidated the Lublin ghetto, who had a hand in killing everyone they ever knew or loved, who followed them to the Warsaw ghetto and fought side by side with the Germans to suppress the Jewish uprising, that some of those same men received visas meant for war refugees and Holocaust survivors and were living here in the United States, hiding in plain sight. And that thought really haunted Felix for a long time. And his son had no good answer. He couldn't explain it to him. I mean, who could? And so these men were, hopefully all of them, were caught over the years by this unit inside the Justice Department. It started in 1979. It took a while because the INS was doing it, Immigration and Naturalization Services. They were trying to do it, but weren't doing a very good job. And so in the 1970s, a congresswoman from Brooklyn named Elizabeth Holtzman said, wait a minute, there are Nazi war criminals living on US soil? And the reason she became enraged is because Simon Wiesenthal called in a tip from Israel to the Justice Department that a housewife living in Queens, New York, had once served in the Majdanek concentration camp in Lublin. And she was actually in leadership there and had earned the reputation of the stomping mare because she had used the soles of her jackboots to brutalize children. And after the war, she married an American GI, lied about her identity, settled in Queens, New York. Very quiet life. When Simon Wiesenthal found out, he called in a tip. The Justice Department kicked in and worked to strip her of her US citizenship and remove her from US soil. But this young Elizabeth Holtzman from Brooklyn, who was serving in US Congress, was so outraged that she called for congressional hearings and ultimately forced the government to create a dedicated Nazi hunting unit inside the criminal division of the Justice Department. And this unit was ultimately staffed with prosecutors and historians. This unit was limited in a lot of ways because they couldn't press criminal charges against people who had committed crimes on foreign soil against non-US citizens, right? The Constitution didn't allow it. But this unit could take people to civil court, strip them of their citizenship, since so many had come to the United States and ultimately became naturalized citizens. So this unit could seek to strip them of their citizenship in federal court and then take them to immigration court and try to convince a judge to order these men, and in some handful of cases women, removed from US soil. And I remember asking myself, what motivated these historians and prosecutors to do this work? Was it revenge? Was it retribution? We see Nazi hunting shows on Amazon and these intense and exciting shows, but really it was much more nuanced than that. It was really about taking back what these men should not have been given in the first place, which was a visa meant for a Holocaust survivor or a war refugee. And it was also about not allowing collaborators who had assisted in mass murder the right to die in the United States alongside Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans. They should not have been allowed to be here in the first place, let alone die here in peace. And really that's what drove the people inside this unit. It was a sense that delayed justice is better than no justice at all. And it was the idea that they wanted to send a message to the rest of the world that mass murderers, collaborators, and others will never be able to live in peace here in the United States. And so this unit was formed in 1979, and everyone thought it would do its work for 3 years and close up. I mean, how many Nazi war criminals could actually be living here in the United States? Turned out this unit did its work for 30 years. And they faced incredible pushback, both here and abroad. And I'll describe to you just very briefly a little bit about what they faced. You know, here in the US, judges were several generations removed from the war by the time these cases went to court. And so it was very hard to convince some judges that men who looked like this during the war, this is Jacob Reimer, the book is named Citizen 865, that's his dog tag number. Jacob Reimer was the most trusted Travniki man found on US soil. And it's hard to convince a judge that this man, who was Jacob Reimer in the 1990s, actually had a hand in Nazi persecution. And there were conservative columnists, Pat Buchanan and others, who pushed back saying, what is this, revenge? Leave these little old men alone. They were just young boys when this happened. And so they really had to kind of overcome that at this inside this Nazi hunting unit. They also faced great resistance for many, many years from Austria and Germany. They didn't want to take back Nazis who were found on US soil, even though the Germans had, of course, armed them and empowered them. They just wanted to kind of wipe their hands of it. And so in 1988, just before Hanukkah, this unit inside the Justice Department, it's called OSI, by the way, or the Office of Special Investigations, received word that the Austrians were relenting and that they were going to accept back Austrian-born Nazi war criminals found on US soil. And so this unit sent Michael Bernstein, a 33-year-old prosecutor, to Vienna to get the paperwork signed. And so just before Hanukkah, Michael said goodbye to his young children and wife. He flew to Vienna, he got the deal signed. He wanted to get home in time to celebrate Hanukkah with his son and his daughter, and he switched to an earlier flight, and he happened to switch to Pan Am Flight 103, which was blown up in the skies over Lockerbie, Scotland by a terrorist bomb. And so many, many years after the end of World War II, Michael Bernstein died in the line of duty trying to get Austria to take back Austrian-born Nazi war criminals found on US soil. This was the most enduring frustration for this unit. Even until recent years, they could not get Germany in particular to take back these Nazis. And an immigration judge can order someone deported, but can't force another country to take them back. So these men, in many cases, were allowed to live here for years, stateless, but still on US soil. And so this was, as I said, the most enduring challenge for this unit. Since I'm talking to a Cleveland audience, I will tell you that John Demjanjuk, who I'm sure many of you know, he was wrongly identified as Ivan the Terrible of the Treblinka death camp. And then when more records became available over the years, the Justice Department realized he had served in the Sobibor death camp in occupied Poland. But for purposes of our discussion today, you should know that Demjanjuk was a Travniki man. Travniki was his base of operations. It's where he was armed, trained, empowered, and from there dispatched to Jewish hubs and the Sobibor killing center in occupied Poland. He was actually, as you all know, or many of you I guess know, ordered deported for a second time, sent back to Germany, tried for war crimes, convicted, and then he died while the case was on appeal, which under German law means that he died and not with his conviction that was with the conviction that was not intact. But Demjanjuk was a Travniki man. And so this unit, as I said, was supposed to, I'm skipping ahead, was supposed to do its work for a few years. It lasted for more than 30. A handful of years ago, it was merged with another unit inside the Justice Department whose focus is with a focus that's on post-World War II uh, uh, crimes. So this unit now focuses on looking for war criminals from Bosnia and Rwanda, Guatemala, other hotspots around the world who may be living here in the United States. But by all accounts, this unit was the most successful Nazi hunting unit in the world, and its director Eli Rosenbaum was widely considered to be among the most successful Nazi hunters in the world. And I'll open it up to questions, but I wanted to tell you what happened to Felix and Lucy, though I'm hoping you'll read the book to find out. Felix and Lucy ended the war, they ended up living in the Midwest. And Felix was a pediatrician who served generations of children. And Felix died in his early 90s in his armchair watching an ice hockey game and died in his sleep. And his wife, Lucy, turned to her son and said, I'm not going to live for 6 months without him. 6 more months, that's it. And it really makes sense if you think about it, because the only one who knew Lucy's family was Felix. The only person who could remind Felix what his sister's voice sounded like was Lucy. And so, true to her word, she died 6 months later on what would have been their 75th wedding anniversary in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's a beautiful story. All survivor stories are extraordinary. For me, there was a pull to this family, to Felix and to Lucy. She turned to a rabbi later in life and said, you always say that God giveth and then God taketh away, but in my life, it's just the opposite. And she would point to the row in the synagogue of her children and grandchildren, filling up an entire row. And this just made Lucy so happy. To report this book, I traveled to a number of countries. I went back to Travniki to see what was still there, and there's very few signs of anything that went on, that there had once been a school for mass murder there. You just couldn't tell. And I also went back and reviewed the original Nazi roster in Prague that Peter Black and Barry White found, that showed Jacob Reimer, a citizen 865, had served in this camp. And I really learned a little bit from this book. First of all, it was an unexplored piece of Holocaust history. I really wanted to share it with mainstream audiences, because the history essentially lived inside the heads of these historians. Peter Black is now the world's foremost expert on Travniki, and I wanted to tell people about the role these Travniki men played in the persecution of Poland's Jews, and also to talk about the great challenges and successes of this Nazi hunting unit. And I really walked away from this realizing that genocide doesn't start with one person. It doesn't start with one moment in time. That it takes a whole organization and tens of thousands of collaborators to do this kind of work. And that's what the Travniki men really were. They were not the high-profile names that we hear about. They were, as George Will, the columnist, put it, cogs in a wheel. And every cog in the wheel, according to the people who did this work, needed to be brought to justice. And that delayed justice was better than nothing at all. And that, to me, was really what I came to understand in telling this book. And I dedicated it to my children because I want them to know, essentially that there are good people in government, that good people who are doing this work and wanted to right a wrong and who believe in justice no matter what. And as an investigative reporter for 25 years, writing about the worst in human nature, people who do sell their souls for not a lot of money, um, who steal and do other horrible things. The people in this book, the heroes of this book, are trying to move the needle in the other direction, that they really wanted to do what was right no matter the cost. And I came away as a human being feeling just inspired by their work. And I hope that if you read the book, you will be too. Thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions.
So Debbie, first, I want to let you know that if you were here in person, we'd be giving you a loud round of applause for this, which is just a wonderful story that we who saw you at the Jewish Book Council virtual conference were completely engrossed. And as someone who does a lot of film programming, my first question for you is, have you considered making this story into a movie? I feel like it has all the components.
I do too, and if any of you know any good movie producers, just let me know. We do have an agent in Hollywood who has been talking to different directors and producers, and so we'll see what happens. I also believe that, so fingers crossed.
It really reads like that too. It's
Yeah.
Not your typical nonfiction kind of story.
No. And I'm glad you said that. I didn't write this book for historians because I'm not an historian. I'm not trained to do that. I really wrote it for mainstream audiences, and it's narrative nonfiction in hopes that it will read like a story. So thanks.
And I would contrast that to Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners, which to me really does read more so like a textbook. But anyway, that's fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. Okay, so so many questions. Okay, this is a fun one. What do you think about the TV show Nazi Hunters? And has your research in any way been connected to that show?
So I shouldn't say this because I do work for the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos at Amazon owns the Washington Post, but I have not watched the Nazi Hunters on Amazon. I just haven't done it for all kinds of reasons. This unit inside the Justice Department, over the years, they prosecuted hundreds of people and helped remove from U.S. soil a lot of them. I focused only on one investigation, the men of Travniki. Just so you know, it was a much broader system in place than just what I focused on. But to answer the question, no, I haven't watched the Nazi Hunters.
Okay. Okay, how many people, the questions are coming in here, so my thing just moved. How many people were identified and returned successfully with the Nazi hunting to their home countries?
Yeah. The numbers, I think, vary depending on what you're looking at. I think I reported they prosecuted hundreds of people over 30 plus years and returned a number of them. But it's important to know that even when they were able to remove them from U.S. soil, say to Germany, it's not like they were tried criminally in Germany. Many of them were just removed from U.S. soil and they went on to live and die, somewhere else. But for this unit, they felt like they did everything they could under the law to remove them from U.S. soil, and what happened after that was out of their control. Demjanjuk, however, was a good case where Germany really tried to seek justice there.
And are there any active cases right now? I know you said the units moved on to Bosnia and other war criminals, but are there any active Nazi cases happening right now?
That's a great question, not that I know of, but they wouldn't tell me. It would be secret until there was an actual deportation. That said, just before the pandemic, this unit, Eli Rosenbaum, who still works at the Justice Department, had a hand in prosecuting a man in Tennessee, of all places, who had been living in Tennessee for years and had served the SS during the war. That was just a couple of months, seems like forever ago, but this, in the last 12 months. And in 2018, this unit deported a man from Queens, New York, who had served in Travniki. They deported what they thought, I guess, was the last known Travniki man living in US soil. He had been in Queens, New York for 50 years, and they couldn't convince Germany to take him back. They finally did in 2018. He was 95 years old. He died a few months after his deportation. But they wanted to remove him years and years ago, just couldn't convince Germany to take him.
So similarly, how many Nazi perpetrators in your research were never brought to justice and ended up living and then maybe dying or still living in the US?
Smart question. I don't know that anyone knows if we've missed any. I can tell you at least I think 5 or 8 men were able to die on US soil in recent years because no country would take them back. One was Jacob Reimer, Citizen 865. Even though they knew that he was a trusted platoon leader in Travniki, that he had helped liquidate the Jewish ghetto, that he had fought side by side with the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto, that they had a confession from him that he had shot at a man in a ditch during a Nazi shooting operation. A judge took so long to denaturalize him that by the time Jacob Reimer was denaturalized and Germany said, no, we don't want him back, he died in Pennsylvania in 2005. So he was one of a handful of men who were allowed to die here. In fact, Eli Rosenbaum, the head of this unit, often said he wanted to climb on top of the roof of the Justice Department here in DC, get a megaphone and shout, can you believe that Germany won't take its Nazis back?
So what were the biggest surprises in this, in all the research that you did for this?
So many surprises. One was what I just said. I just had a hard time believing that, I had a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that we couldn't get Germany or Austria to do this. I was surprised that the Jewish community didn't create a bigger fuss right after the war, in the years after the war. My first question I asked on my first formal interview to historian Peter Black was, didn't the Jewish community fight in the 50s? Why wait until the 70s and the 80s and the 90s? And Peter gave me a very smart answer. He said, number one, the Jewish community was exhausted, laying low, being careful politically, and for good reason, an obvious reason. And the US was in the throes of a Cold War. So our enemy was no longer the Nazis, it was communists. So there just wasn't the appetite. And I was really interested in that story and surprised by it, but ultimately it made sense.
So I have a couple questions sort of more related to investigative journalism so how has investigative reporting changed in your experience with the onslaught of information that's available online and social media? Has that, do you see that as helpful? Is it getting in the way? What's your feeling about that with all the information that's available?
Well, we could spend 2 hours answering that question. That's a loaded question and a good one. I will tell you that, and this will not surprise your educated audience, I am sad that a lot of local investigative reporting at regional newspapers isn't what it used to be. There are so many beloved regional newspapers that have faced drastic cuts. And I wonder about school boards and county commissioners and others and mayors who are able to get away with things because an independent press is not watching. But I am feeling a little bit inspired because a lot of places are creating more robust investigative staffs now. There are nonprofit investigative outlets that are doing this work. Major papers like the New York Times, Washington Post are beefing up their investigative staffs. And I think just from this last year, between everything that's going on now, I'm not talking politics, and the coronavirus and everything, you can see this incredible investigative work that's being produced. So in some ways I feel very hopeful about the future of investigative reporting. But I want to see what's happening on a national level be reflected more at a local level, because that's where we need it most.
So related to that, what kind of advice would you have for young people, and you work with students who are interested in going into the field of journalism?
Yes, I work with students and I encourage it. You know, after Watergate, investigative reporting was just considered the most incredible profession. Young people who were so fed up with Vietnam and the government, they just thought, wow, they're going to be the next Woodward and Bernstein. And so there was really this golden age for investigative reporting after that. And it was incredible. I think we're seeing that again now. I really do. I see it reflected in the faces of my students. Social justice journalism, they really want to hold people responsible, accountable for the decisions that they make. And this generation, I work with students, I publish stories with my students. This generation's really impressive. So I think the future of investigative reporting is in good hands, and I encourage all of my students to stick with it.
So you seem so still connected to this book. Your presentation was so interesting. I can't say that enough, and I know all of our audience members agree. What are you working on next, if you have any time? And how do you choose what projects to work on?
Yeah, I'm connected to this book because it just published in November, and I had many, many book talks planned, and the pandemic hit. So I'm so grateful that JCCs and others are still doing these book talks and supporting book festivals and authors. It means a lot to the publishing industry, to the people like me who poured out and gave everything we had to these stories. So thank you. I can't think about my next book because I'm writing coronavirus stories right now for the Washington Post. I'm focused on the nursing home industry. Nursing home residents have tragically been at the epicenter of this virus. And so I'm working 7 days a week on that, and I'm not thinking beyond next week. And, you know, as I said when I was speaking, you know, when I won a Pulitzer Prize, it was at the Miami Herald. I wrote about affordable housing developers who stole money meant for the poor, meant to build homes for the poor. And I've been doing those kinds of stories for years, almost my entire 25-year plus journalism career. And when I write books, I really try to focus on people that I want my sons to grow up to be. And so for my first book, was called Love Wins, and it came out in 2016. It was focused on the civil rights lawyers and plaintiffs who fought for marriage equality before the US Supreme Court. And it was a love story and a legal thriller. And I took my youngest son to meet one of the civil rights lawyers because, of course, I'm trying to get him to go to law school. But I really focus books on people that move and inspire me as a human being. So if I do a third book, and I know I will, that's the kind of thing I'm looking for.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to encourage our audience to pick this up. It really is such a fascinating read. Max Bax, again, is carrying the book for us in addition to all sorts of other outlets. You can find it. Debbie, it was a delight. Thank you to our men's club for joining in today. It was a stimulating program, and we wish you the best of luck. And thank you so much for joining the Cleveland Jewish Book Festival.
Thank you, everybody. Stay healthy and stay well.